G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Isaiah. This has been taken from a commentary by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the founder of RL Ministries Worldwide. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so we're into session 27. Just a quick little burst in last session. Last session, what did we see? We saw the servant of Jehovah. We saw the mission of the servant of Jehovah. What was he supposed to do? Well, he was supposed to bring restoration and salvation to the Jewish people, but it seemed as if the whole nation had rejected him, and that is exactly what they did. Even though he's discouraged, his actual mission hadn't failed, because God says, whoa, hang on, I've got more for you than that. You're going to be a light to the Gentiles also. But he also found out that he was honorable in the eyes of Jehovah, and he says, my God has become my strength. Now, he gets this other commission, which was to be the light to the Gentiles, and so the mission was all pre-planned by God himself. So it wasn't a failure. This was exactly how he planned it to be. And one day we're going to see that he will be the Savior. This servant of Jehovah will one day be exalted, because his mission would have been completed. We saw the rejection. We saw his rejection. He was despised by humanity in general, and he was abhorred by the nation of Israel in particular. But one day he's going to be exalted, and he'll be made a covenant of the people, fulfilling all the Jewish covenants. And when the fullness of the Gentiles come in, then God will once again work with national Israel, so that all Israel will be saved. All obstacles will then be removed, and the Jews will be regathered in to the land as a believing, restored nation. God cannot, remember we said God cannot forget Jerusalem. Why? Because he's got the name Zion engraved in his hands. Also, we found out last session that there are angelic beings on the walls of Jerusalem declaring to God, remember your covenants, remember Jerusalem, O God. Night and day they're reminding God. And so returnees, we're going to see they're going to come back into the land in sometime in the future, once the full number of Gentiles have come in, and then they're going to come back into the land. They're going to be led back into the land by the righteous Gentiles, the sheep Gentiles, who will bring them back into the land, who will also protect them as they come back into the land, and who will be in subjection to the nation of Israel. Now, the bad guys, the unrighteous Gentiles, will recognize at that time that Jehovah is Israel's Redeemer, Jehovah is Israel's Savior, Jehovah is the mighty one of Jacob, and then they'll be dispensed with. So that's a quick burst in what we did last session. Okay, getting into this session now. All right, we're going to see the sufferings of the servant of Jehovah. We're going to be in chapter 50, verses 1 to 11. We're going to see the separation of Jehovah and the wife of Jehovah in verses 1 to 3. Now, relationship of Israel as Jehovah's wife is viewed throughout the scriptures in various ways and facets. And we're going to look at it in 6 stages. We're going to look at this. Now, in the first stage of her, this is a little bit of a background so we can understand further on. In the first stage of her relationship as the wife of Jehovah, Israel entered into a marriage contract. And this marriage contract is the book of Deuteronomy. And we see that in those passages there on the screen, Deuteronomy 5, Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 7, also Ezekiel 16:8. Second stage is Israel's great adultery. Although Israel was very sternly admonished to remain faithful to her husband, what did she do? She became guilty of adultery, described by several of the prophets in the Hebrew scriptures, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Hosea particularly. Third stage is the separation between God and Israel in the days of Isaiah because of Israel's adultery. We see that, we're going to see it in Isaiah 50 verse 1. The fourth stage is the divorce, and this is even after about 100 years of separation, during which time the blessings of Deuteronomy continued to be withheld. Israel still failed to return to God, her husband. And so God finally divorced his wife, and the bill of divorcement is contained in Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 6 to 10. Jeremiah 3, 6 to 10. That was the fourth stage, and that's the divorce. Fifth stage now is the punishment. The original marriage contract, the book of Deuteronomy, clearly declared that if Israel proved unfaithful as Jehovah's wife, it would become necessary for God to punish her. And we can find that in Ezekiel chapter 16 and Ezekiel 16, 35 to 43 and 58 to 59. Also, Hosea. Hosea speaks a lot about the punishment of Israel, the wife of Jehovah, the divorced wife of Jehovah. Hosea 2, 6 to 13. Now, to this day, Israel is still in the period of punishment. And this is proven by the persecutions of the Jews around the world and by the present worldwide dispersion. So that was the fifth stage, the punishment stage. The sixth stage is going to be the remarriage with restored blessings. The Jewish prophets did not leave things in a state of hopelessness because they spoke of a day when Israel will become the restored wife of Jehovah. Of course, this day will require a brand new marriage contract, which we're going to find in Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34. That's the new covenant. And Ezekiel 16, 60 to 63, again, the new covenant. Isaiah 54, 1 to 8. Isaiah 62, 4 to 5. And Hosea chapter 2, 14 to 23. So that is the 6 stages of Israel as Jehovah's wife. We go from the marriage contract right down through the divorce, through the punishment, right down to when the marriage will be restored with restored blessings. All right. Verses 1 to 11, we see the sufferings of the servant of Jehovah. So with that background, we just went through with the stages of marriage. 1 to 3 will be a little bit easier to understand. In previous chapters, Isaiah revealed how deeply Judah and Israel had sunk into idolatry. And as a result, God withheld many of the physical blessings from his wife in keeping with the Torah, which is the law of Moses, first 5 books of Moses. In the days of Isaiah, a separation took place between God and Israel. And here we see it in verses 1 to 3. Thus says Jehovah, where is the bill of your mother's divorcement, wherewith I have put her away? Or which of my creditors is it to whom I have sold you? Behold, for your iniquities were you sold, and for your transgressions was your mother put away. This is just verse 1 here. Now, we must remember here, these chapters of Isaiah, remember that these are written prophetically to the generation of Israel 150 years later, towards the end of the Babylonian captivity. Now, by that time, the Jews are seen as complaining in verse 1 of chapter 50 of Isaiah's book. They're saying that God has divorced us and sold us into slavery. However, God says that your captivity by my people was neither a divorce, because Israel is the wife of Jehovah, nor was it the selling into slavery. Well, what was it? And he proves this through 2 points. First of all, he says, there was no bill of divorcement. If I divorced you, there would be a bill of divorcement. Where is that bill of divorcement? There isn't one. Now, bill of divorcement. According to Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, if a husband, this is Mosaic law, if a husband wished to divorce his wife, he had to write out a decree or a bill of divorcement. And after having written it out in longhand, and there's no shorthand, the husband would then give it to his wife, and then the divorce will be final. As easy as that. Now later, God will issue a bill of divorcement. As we said before, the book of Jeremiah is that bill of divorcement. In Isaiah's day, there is simply a separation, but not a divorce. The actual divorce will occur 100 years later. But in Isaiah's day, there was only a separation between Jehovah and his wife Israel, but no divorce. Second, God says, which of my creditors is it to whom I've sold you? So God is not in debt to any man to have to sell his children into slavery. We must remember the background to these 2 statements is the Mosaic law. All right, 2 points here. First, under the Mosaic law, for a man to divorce his wife, he had to issue her a bill of divorcement. Had to write it up, give it to her. Second, if a man got into trouble or into debt under the Mosaic law and was unable to pay, he could sell his own children into slavery. Therefore, God said, I have not sold you into slavery. To whom was I indebted that I had to sell you? To what man was I indebted to? that I needed to sell you into slavery. No one. The problem is not divorcement or that I was in debt and I had to sell you into slavery. That's not the problem. What's the problem? Well, the problem is found in the second part of verse 1. Behold, for your iniquities were you sold, and for your transgression was your mother put away. So your iniquities and your transgressions are the reasons for your captivity, not of divorcement, not of slavery or debt selling. Rather, Israel's own iniquities and transgressions brought about the separation, enslavement, and captivity. And then in verse 2, God gives another reason for Israel's captivity and enslavement. When God issued the call for salvation, no one responded. Wherefore, this is a passage, wherefore, when I came, was there no man? When I called, was there none to answer? So when God issued a call for salvation, Israel did not respond. Nor is a problem with God's power or the ability to save. Because second part of verse 2 and verse 3 says, is my hand shortened at all, that it cannot redeem? Or have I no power to deliver? Of course not. He says, my hand is not short that I am unable to reach out and save you. That's not the problem. The problem is not with God's power. In verse 2c, the third part of verse 2, behold, at my rebuke I dry up the sea. I make the rivers a wilderness. Their fish stink because there is no water and die for thirst. God's power dried up the Red Sea. And in verse 3, I clothe the heavens with blackness and I make sackcloth their covering. His power stretched out the heavens and created the expanse of space. So the problem is not God's power, because he can do it. The problem is your sins. Israel's sins, her idolatry, had made the separation between God and his wife necessary. It was they which created the captivity and the enslavement. Israel's sins must be paid for. Now at this point, we come to the servant of Jehovah in verses 4 to 9. We're not giving much information concerning how Jesus grew up and the knowledge he possessed in his humanity. In his deity, Jesus knew everything. However, in his humanity, he had to undergo a learning process like every other man. In his humanity, he had to learn certain things. Although Jesus was brought up in a spiritual Jewish home, this alone cannot explain his tremendous knowledge. Knowledge that allowed him to carry on an intelligent theological discussion with the experts of the Mosaic law by the age of 12. Check it out in Luke chapter 2, 41 to 52. The doctors of the law, the Pharisees, were astounded at his knowledge. How did he gain his knowledge? We're not told in the New Testament how Jesus learned and how he acquired this knowledge in his humanity. Luke simply summarizes. Luke just says, well, he grew up in knowledge and in the wisdom of the Lord. How then did he learn? How did he learn? We do not know from any gospel writer, but we know from Isaiah. For Isaiah tells us here in verse 4, Isaiah 50 verse 4, the Lord Jehovah has given me the tongue of them that are taught, that I may know how to sustain with words him that is weary. This is talking about the young Jesus here. He was discipled by God the Father. In the very early hours of the morning, God the Father aroused God the Son and taught or discipled him in his humanity. He taught him his mission in chapter 49. Morning by morning, God the Father discipled the Son and prepared him for his mission. In the teaching ministry, which was the finest seminary training anyone could possibly receive directly from God the Father, the Son in his humanity was trained. Notice one of the key things he was trying to accomplish. It was how to speak a word in season to him who is weary. He learned to sustain the one who is weary with words. An example of the success of his training is seen in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. Matthew 11, 28 to 30. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This passage explains what we're told in Isaiah 50 verse 4. One of the things he learned from his father was how to sustain the weary with specific words. He wakened morning by morning. He wakened mine ear to hear as they that are taught. Now, the word taught in the Hebrew is not a verb, as it is here in the English. It is a noun. It's a word called limudim, which means disciples. So he awakened my ear to hear as a disciple. That's what it actually means. He awakened my ear to hear as a disciple. Just as we need to be taught or discipled, so the Son was discipled by the Father. He was trained how to give meaningful words which would sustain the weary. However, that was not all that he was trying to accomplish. There's more. In verses 5 to 6, he was trained for his coming rejection of his messiahship. The Lord Jehovah has opened mine ear, and I was not rebellious, neither turned away backward. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. So in verse 5, Isaiah 50, we're told here that the servant did not react against the mistreatment that he underwent. The Lord Jehovah has opened mine ear. Messiah was not only trained to sustain the weary with words, he was also trained so that when the despisement and mistreatment came at his trial and the crucifixion, he at no time rebelled. There was no animosity toward those who mistreated him. At no point during his trials and sufferings did he grind his teeth in anger and rebellion. That did not occur. Why not? Because morning by morning the Father trained him for the task of mistreatment which he would experience. He was not rebellious, nor did he turn away backward, because he was well trained. His training had been incorporated into his life. Verse 6 describes his mistreatment. I gave my back to the smiters and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. So first of all, we see he gave his back to the smiters. At no point did he attempt to retreat from the blows which came. At no point did he attempt to retreat into a corner from the mistreatment. He did not retreat from the lashes. He gave his back to the scourging that was given to him before his crucifixion. Second, he gave his cheeks to those that plucked out the hair. This shows that Jesus had a beard, for his hair was plucked out. To understand this, we must return to the Old Testament concept regarding beards. In the Jewish society of the time, pulling out someone's facial hair was a sign of utter contempt. Check that out in Ezra 9 verse 3, Ezra 9:3, and Nehemiah 13:25. Nehemiah 13:25. It was also one of the highest indignities on the Jewish law, punishable by fines. You'd be fined. In fact, it was the highest fine if you plucked out someone's beard. Third, it says that I hid not my face from shame and spitting. So when they began to spit upon Jesus, he didn't lift his hands to his face to protect himself from the spittle. He kept his hands down. He took the full brunt of the spittle as it came. The fulfillment of all of this is found in 4 passages. We see them in Matthew 26:27, Matthew 26:67, Matthew 27:26 and 30, Mark 14:65, and John 18:22. But while on the one hand Messiah was despised by men, he was aided by Jehovah in verses 7 to 9. Messiah was despised by men, but he was accepted by God. And for that reason, 3 points are made concerning this servant. First of all, in verse 7, for the Lord Jehovah will help me. Therefore have I not been confounded. Therefore have I set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall not be put to shame. The servant was not confounded because he recognized that God the Father would come to his aid. because he recognized his relationship with God the Father, he then set his face like a flint to the sufferings to which he was called. The reason he gave his back to the smiters and allowed his beard to be plucked out and did not hide his face from shame and spitting is because he recognized that the Father was with him. And because of this, he set his face like a flint to the task that was before him. The specific task was to suffer. Luke, the Gospel of Luke, used a similar expression when he wrote that Messiah steadfastly, like a flint, set his face to go to Jerusalem. Check that out in Luke 9:51. Luke 9:51. Matthew 16:21 and 23. Matthew 16:21, 23. And Mark 8:31, 33. Mark 8:31 to 33 also depict Messiah's resolute determination to complete his mission. Second thing we see in verse 8, the servant would be justified. He is nearer that justifies me. Who will contend with me? Let us stand up together. Who is my adversary? Let him come near to me. No one can contend with this servant. No one can take him to trial because it is the Father who will justify him. This justification came by means of the resurrection. Now, if you got your Bible, you can turn to Romans chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. Romans 1, 3 to 4. I'll read it for you here. Concerning his Son, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, who was declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead, even Jesus Christ our Lord. So Jesus always was the Son of God. However, the justification and proof of his sonship with God the Father came by means of resurrection. He did not become the Son of God through his resurrection. His resurrection proved that he was the Son of God. Another passage, 1 Timothy 3:16. 1 Timothy 3:16, 1 Timothy 3:16, I'll read it for you. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. He who was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached among the nations, believed on in the world, received up in glory. Notice that he was justified in the spirit by being received up into glory after the resurrection. The resurrection proved and justified the Son's claims. Third thing we see in verse 9. The servant is uncondemned. Behold, the Lord Jehovah will help me. Who is he that shall condemn me? Behold, all they shall wax old as a garment. The moth shall eat them up. Once again, this is the recognition of God the Father's aid. Those who will dare to contend or challenge the Son will die with age like an old piece of cloth. The servant is eternal. He will live forever because of the resurrection which justified his claims. But as for those who are going to, or who will contend or dispute his claims, they'll fade away and die, like a garment that grows old and is eaten by a moth. They'll all fade away and be non-existent. Now we see the message here in verses 10 and 11 to believers and unbelievers. Isaiah is now speaking. So far in chapters 49 and 50, either the Father or the Son have been speaking, primarily the servant. But now the finale has taken place in verse 9, and Isaiah now speaks in verses 10 and 11. He's talking to his people. Who is among you that fears Jehovah, that obeys the voice of his servant? He that walks in darkness and has no light, let him trust in the name of Jehovah and rely upon his God. So verse 10 is addressed to believers. Message to believers is this: they are to fear Jehovah and to obey the suffering servant. Though they walk in darkness without light, they are to trust in the name of Jehovah. Even in darkness, they are to rely upon their God. That is the benefit of believers. No matter how dark the circumstances may be, if they fear God the Father and if they obey God the Son, They can rely on the Trinitarian God, and God will bring them through the darkness. But now in verse 11, we have a message to unbelievers. Behold, all ye that kindle a fire, that gird yourselves about with firebrands, walk ye in the flame of your fire, and among the brands that you have kindled. This shall ye have of my hand. You shall lie down in sorrow. So as for unbelievers now, Isaiah says they have kindled their own fire. The very fire they have kindled themselves will ultimately destroy them. They shall lie down in sorrow or torment, which is an expression for hell. As for unbelievers, because of their unbelief, that unbelief kindles a fire. That fire eventually kills them, and they'll be tormented by fire for all eternity. For believers, no matter how dark it becomes, continue to rely on the Lord. For unbelievers, their destiny is torment. Their unbelief kindles a fire that will eventually land them in the lake of fire for all eternity. We're into chapter 51, verses 1 to 3. Well, this section, awake, awake, goes from 51:1 to 52:12. In this passage, we're going to see that the key expression is awake, awake. See it 3 times. In 51 verse 9 and verse 17, and 52 verse 1. The phrase is essentially the theme of the entire section from 51:1 to 52:12. Verses 1 to 8, the heading is Comfort to the Faithful Remnant. In verses 1 to 8, God is addressing the faithful remnant within Israel as he gives them 3 messages of comfort. And this is divided into 3 sections here. The comfort that came from Israel's origin, that's verses 1 to 3, from God's salvation, verses 4 to 6, and from knowing the fate of the enemy, verses 7 to 8. All right, comfort from Israel's origin, verses 1 to 3. This is the first message of comfort that comes from the fact of Israel's origin. The believing remnant within Israel was becoming more and more disheartened than any other group. Because of the very small numbers, the faithful remnant believed that Israel will never grow as a nation because of her unbelief and her rejection of the servant of Jehovah. The rejection of Israel as Messiah was given to us back in 49 to 50, chapters 49 to 50. First of all, a message of comfort to this faithful remnant that feels that Israel cannot grow and will not grow by pointing to Israel's origin history. They should learn and be encouraged by this, by what occurred in the past. This call in verse 1 says, hearken to me, or hearken ye to me. This is clearly speaking to the faithful remnant, because the following expression makes this clear. You that follow after righteousness, you that seek Jehovah. So this is the remnant. He's clearly not addressing all of Israel here. He's only addressing that segment of Israel, that small segment of Israel, the believing remnant, within the nation that follows after righteousness and seeks the Lord. This is his faithful remnant. And the second part of verse 1 to verse 3 is the actual message. So we see him addressing the faithful remnant. Now the message is, look unto the rock whence you were hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence you were digged. The remnant was now to remember the rock from which they were cut, and the pit or quarry from which they were hewn. Now, verse 2 explains the meaning of the term rock and quarry. Look unto Abraham, this is it. Look unto Abraham your father, and unto Sarah that bore you. The rock was Abraham, and the quarry is Sarah. For when he was but one, this is Abraham, for when he was but one, I called him, and I blessed him, and made him many. What's the point? What's the point of all of this? How large was the Jewish nation in the days of Abraham? How many were there? Abraham was all alone. There was only one man. The entire race would have died out if he had died. If Abraham never had a son, the Jewish race would have ended. So God is now reminding them that in the days of Abraham, there was only one Jew and his wife Sarah. He reminded them that from that one couple came a nation. Surely, the believing remnant was greater than one person. If God can make a great nation from one person and his wife, then he can certainly make a greater nation from a small group of believing remnant. However, when Abraham was the only Jew living, yet he fathered a whole nation. God uses three words. First of all, I called him. Second, I blessed him. And third, I made him many. That's the point of comfort here. God says, when I do the calling, then I do the blessing. Then when I do the blessing, then it's going to multiply. So even though the Jewish remnant of that day and the Jewish Christians today are very small, nevertheless, God did the calling and the blessing. He will do the increasing. The increasing or multiplying is his task. One day, he will make the faithful remnant become many, because the clear teaching from the previous chapters is that one day the entire Jewish nation will be saved. In verse 3, he now turns to the future. For Jehovah has comforted Zion. He has comforted all her waste places and has made her a wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of Jehovah. Joy and gladness shall be found therein, thanksgiving and the voice of melody. The words of comfort from the past should provide words of comfort for the future. God's acts from the past should give comfort for believing the great future that Israel has. The Lord will comfort Zion. He will make her a wilderness like Eden. Her desert will blossom like the garden of the Lord. And this is going to result in four things. First of all, joy. Second, gladness. Third, thanksgiving. Fourth, the voice of melody, the voice of singing. The first three verses here were comfort from Israel's origin. Now, verses 6 to 4 are going to be comfort from God's salvation. In verse 4, we have a second call to the believing remnant. Attend unto me, give ear unto me. The reason we know that this is not the whole nation, but the believing remnant, because it says, O my people, O my nation, and I will establish my justice for a light of the peoples. Hebrew term for peoples here is amim, and since the noun is in the plural, it refers to Gentiles and the Gentile nations. So he's saying here, I'll establish my justice for a light to the Gentile nations. And so they were to listen to him, because at the end of verse 4 he says, a law shall go forth from me. Now, what law is he dealing with here? This is not the law of Moses, right? For that law was never given to the Gentiles. He's just talking about the Gentiles here. That law was never given to the Gentiles. This is the law he mentioned many chapters earlier on. In Isaiah chapter 2, he first announced the Messianic kingdom, which will draw all the Gentile nations towards it. Nevertheless, notice to what he's drawing the Gentile nations. I'll read Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 to 3 for you. Isaiah 2, 2 to 3. And it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of Jehovah's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, let us go up to the mountain of Jehovah, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of Jehovah from Jerusalem. Now, Gentile nations are going to be drawn to Jerusalem to learn the law. This is not the Mosaic law, which was never given to the Gentiles to begin with. This is the millennial law. This is the Messianic age law, which will be applied to the Gentile nations of the kingdom. So the law will go forth from him. For out of Zion shall go forth the law. And by means of this millennial kingdom law, he will then establish his justice for a light to the peoples, repeating a promise that was made in Isaiah 49:6. He's going to be a light to the nations. Moreover, what we see in verse 5, my righteousness is near. My salvation has gone forth. Righteousness is what? It's the result of salvation. When one receives Jesus, he becomes saved by virtue of having salvation. The result of having salvation is to be justified. It is to be declared righteous. And that is what justification means, to be declared righteous. The righteousness of Jesus Christ the Messiah is applied to us, and then we are declared to be righteous. Therefore, righteousness is the result of the salvation. And here it is, and it has gone forth to all the nations. Therefore, it is international. God will judge the peoples by means of his arms, right? His arms. Distant lands will receive his salvation and righteousness. At the end of verse 5, he says, and mine arms shall judge the peoples, the isles shall wait for me. Now notice there is a distinction here between plural arms, plural, and a singular arm. Arms, plural, is referring to God's justice. He will judge the peoples by means of his arms, and distant lands will his judgment. And distant lands his judgment. Now, notice what he then says at the end of verse 5. And on mine arm, one singular, shall they trust. Now, how can one trust on one arm? Here it's used singular. It's a singular arm. Now, at this point, Isaiah is introducing a theme that will be developed wonderfully in chapter 53, because there will be an interplay between the arm of God and the giving of salvation. There's going to be an interplay between the arm of God and the giving of salvation. Look at verse 51, look at chapter 51, verse 9. Chapter 51, verse 9. I'll read it for you. Awake, awake, put on thy strength, O arm of Jehovah. Now, with the word arm here used of Jehovah is greatly personified. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of Jehovah. Now, with that in mind, let's shoot forward to Isaiah 53 verses 1 to 2. Isaiah 53, 1 to 2. They're there on your screen. 51, 9 and 53, 1 to 2. I'll read 53, 1 to 2 for you. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord of Jehovah been revealed? For he grew up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form nor comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. Now, the pronoun he in verse 2, where it says he grew up, refers to who? It refers to the Messiah. However, what is the antecedent to the pronoun he in verse 2? It is the arm of Jehovah in verse 1. Who is the arm of Jehovah? The arm of Jehovah is the Messiah, the servant of Jehovah. This arm concept will be developed later on in Isaiah, but it is introduced here in 51:5. Let's reread verse 5. My righteousness is near. As we said, remember, righteousness is a result of salvation. My salvation, Yeshua with an H in the end, is gone forth. Hebrew for Jesus is the same root word, Yeshua, without an H in the end. Now read this again. My righteousness is near. My Yeshua, or my Jesus, is gone forth. Mine arms, God's judgments, shall judge the peoples. The isles shall wait for me, and on mine arm shall they trust. So how will these Gentile people gain the salvation which results in righteousness? By trusting in God's arm. Who is God's arm? Isaiah 53, the servant of Jehovah. These are the connecting thoughts we're seeing here. Isaiah introduces the motif here, and he's going to develop it later on. And we're going to follow the development when we get to it. They will gain righteousness that will then result in salvation by trusting in God's arm. God's arm is the Messiah, Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach. Note the connection. Isaiah introduces it here and develops this concept in much greater detail later on. There is a difference between the plural arms and the singular arm. The singular is personified and given characteristics of personality. You do not talk to an arm. In verse 9, he's speaking to the arm, but the arm is a person. The arm is a son of the Father's right hand. Stretch out the hand and you have an arm. Now, verses 4 to 6, continuing. Having spelled out in verse 5 that the salvation will come through God's arm or the messianic person, in verse 6, he now brings out that the salvation granted to the people will be eternal. Lift up your eyes to the heavens and look upon the earth beneath. For the heavens shall vanish away like smoke, and the earth shall wax old like a garment. And they that dwell therein shall die in like manner. But my salvation shall be forever, and my righteousness shall not be abolished. Now, although the heavens and earth will pass away, his salvation and righteousness are eternal. The time is coming when the entire universal order and system will pass away. However, once God's salvation, his Yeshua, is granted to a person, it will never disappear. The present order of the universe is temporary, and someday it's going to be done away with like an old garment. Those who are still on the earth will die in like manner. But the present salvation we possess through this messianic person is eternal. His righteousness will not be shattered or annihilated. Eternal security is not only a New Testament doctrine, for it is found right here in the Old Testament. He says, but my salvation will be forever, and my righteousness shall not be abolished. So the first comfort for the faithful remnant to look back to Israel's history. Regardless of how small the beginning, God can do great things. The second comfort is that the salvation God offers will go out to the Gentiles, and it is eternal. Therefore, the remnant should rejoice and be happy over their salvation. Now we have the third word of comfort in verses 7 to 8 against the remnant's enemies. Hearken unto me, this is verse 7. Hearken unto me, you that know righteousness, the people in whose heart is my law. Fear ye not the reproach of men, neither be ye dismayed at their revilings. Once again, this is a call to the believing remnant. We know this from two phrases here. Can you see them? You who know righteousness. It's the first one. Second, you people in whose heart is my law. The law in the inward man is a sign of one's salvation. One can keep the law externally and still be lost. But if one has the law internally in his heart, that is a mark of his salvation. Keeping the law is another sign of salvation. Once again, he addresses the faithful remnant, the ones who know righteousness and the ones who have God's law within them. The point here in verse 7 is this. Do not fear the reproach of men, nor be terrified by their insults. Well, why? The reason is given in verse 8. For the moth shall eat them up like a garment, and the worm shall eat them like wool. But my righteousness shall be forever, and my salvation shall be unto all generations. Two reasons. First of all, the enemies are going to die of age. The enemies that they have may seemingly last a very long time, but they're going to eventually die of old age. Second, the salvation of righteousness they now possess through the arm of Jehovah will last forever. So verses 1 to 8 were the three reasons for comfort for the faithful remnant. Now this next section is awake, awake, O arm of Jehovah, in verses 9 to 16. Verses 9 to 16 encompasses both a prayer, verses 9 to 11, and the answer to the prayer in verse 12 to 16, in verses 12 to 16. Passage begins with the first mention of the key expression, awake, awake. That's the theme which we saw before of Isaiah 51 verse 1 to 52 verse 12. As the discussion of verse 9 will show, the first awake is addressed to the arm of Jehovah. First comes a call in verse 9. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of Jehovah. So here, The call is to the personality known as the arm of Jehovah. In chapter 52, this will clearly be the messianic person himself. The purpose of the call is for him to put on strength. Now, second part of verse 9 and verse 10, there is a reminder here of past miracles that this messianic person has accomplished. Awake, this is the second part of verse 9, awake as in the days of old, the generations of ancient times. Is it not you that did cut Rahab in pieces, that did pierce the monster? What is he saying here? What's he saying is this. On the basis of past miracles, this messianic person will be asked to do some future miracles. What are these past miracles? Well, some past miracles are mentioned. First of all, you have cut Rahab in pieces. Now, this is not Rahab the harlot, right? The name Rahab is a poetical name for Egypt. Now, Isaiah has already used it in this way once before, right back in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 7. Chapter 30, verse 7 says, "For Egypt helps in vain and to no purpose. Therefore have I called her Rahab," that's Egypt, "that sits still." Okay? Psalm 87, verse 4. Oh, I didn't put that there, but Psalm 87, verse 4. "I will make mention of Rahab and Babylon as among them that know me." So the reference to Rahab, that's Psalm 87, verse 4. The reference to Rahab is a reference to the miracles of the Exodus. Therefore, what Isaiah 51:9 is talking about is the miracles of the Exodus. The reference is back to past miracles, primarily the miracles of the Exodus when Rahab or Egypt was cut in pieces. Now, notice the second phrase here, that did pierce the monster. Okay, now, who does the monster refer to? The monster refers to Pharaoh. Can we prove it? Well, not from this verse, but if we go to Ezekiel 29:3, Ezekiel 29:3, I'll read it for you. "Speak and say, thus says the Lord Jehovah, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great monster that lies in the midst of his rivers." Now, moving along from Ezekiel 29 to Ezekiel 32. Ezekiel 32, verse 2. "Son of man, take up a lamentation over Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say unto him, you were likened unto a young lion of the nations, yet are you as a monster in the seas." The monster of the sea in Isaiah 51:9 is a reference to Pharaoh. And when did God pierce Pharaoh? Well, when he slew his firstborn in the 10th plague. Therefore, the reference in verse 9 is to what God did in the Exodus. In verse 10, this is also true here. "Is not you that dried up the sea? Is it not you that dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, that made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over?" And who's he talking about here? Well, the drying up of the sea is a reference to the drying up of the Red Sea to allow the Jews to cross over to escape from the Egyptians. The term Passover, see the term Passover for the redeemed Passover, the term Passover is mentioned in this verse. The miracle occurred to allow the Israelites to escape the Egyptians. As the account of the Exodus shows, the person who performed many of the miracles was the angel of Jehovah. And you can see a reference to him there in Exodus 3, verses 2 to 6. Exodus 3, 2 to 6, the burning bush. This is the second person of the Trinity, the same person who is referred to as the arm of Jehovah in the Isaiah passage. So what we see in verse 9, the call was, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of Jehovah." This was to the messianic person to put on his strength, and then this messianic person is reminded of the past miracles. But how were a lot of the miracles of the Exodus performed? Reference is made to a special person repeatedly throughout the Exodus passage. He appeared in a burning bush, for example, and he goes on from there, ultimately to lead the people of Israel throughout their journeys. Again, we read that the angel of Jehovah accomplished these miracles. This is the same person who is referred to as the arm of Jehovah, the second person of the Trinity. On the basis of what he was able to accomplish for Israel in the past during the Exodus, he's now asked in verse 11 to perform future miracles to accomplish and fulfill prophecy. And the ransomed of Jehovah shall return and come with singing unto Zion. And everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Now, this verse as it reads in this context doesn't make any sense, does it? It's a different concept here. What we see here is that he begins in his prayer in verses 9 to 10 by dealing with the miracles of the Exodus. And then suddenly he gives this song in verse 11 that does not seem to be connected to anything else that has been said. It just like it comes out of the blue. What Isaiah is doing in verse 11, he's actually directly quoting a previous prophecy that was given earlier. Go back into Isaiah 35:10. Isaiah 35:10 speaks of the worldwide regathering of Israel with the restoration of the land, when the land will be beautified in the Messianic kingdom. So chapter 35 of Isaiah was dealing with the events of the Messianic kingdom. Let me read 35:10 to you. Isaiah 35:10. Listen how it is. It's exactly the same. And the ransomed of Jehovah shall return and come with singing unto Zion, and everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Exactly the same as verse 11. What Isaiah is doing in 51:11, he's quoting a prophecy that God gave him back in 35 verse 10 in reference to Israel's final restoration in the land. And the reason he quoted this verse in verse 11 is to remind God of a previous prophecy. Isaiah asks God to perform new miracles to bring about the final restoration of Israel. So the connection between verses 9 to 11 is this. In light of God's past miracles in the Exodus, he's asked to bring about new miracles to fulfill prophecy. So that is the prayer through verses 9 to 11. And that brings us to the end of this session. Study hard, grow strong.